Hello, and welcome to our second module in our Psychotherapy Foundation and Formulation Introduction. In the first module, we considered the skill to mentalize, which enables us to reflect on our inner experiences, the things that motivate us and drive our behavior, such as our values, our beliefs, our wishes, desires, and our emotions. These are all the things that drive our behavior. And mentalizing is this capacity to reflect on that in ourselves and others. We also thought about how mentalizing helps us work through the inevitable misunderstandings that happen in our lives and builds resilience for us in terms of our mental well-being. And we thought a little bit about the relevance of this skill to symptoms of depression, anxiety, and trauma. So in this second module, we're going to focus in on one of those aspects of our inner experiences, and that's our emotions, which is quite an important aspect of our mental well-being. We're going to be focusing in this module on emotions. There's a link between our emotions and our ability to keep reflecting, to keep mentalizing. And we're going to show you about that relationship in the next slide. We also know that emotions are really important in our general mental well-being. And broadly speaking, there can be emotions can get out of balance in two ways. Either emotions can become too intense and too strong for us, or at the other end of that spectrum, we can find ourselves a bit numb and a bit cut off from our emotions, and that can equally bring us difficulties in relation to our mental well-being. So we're going to focus today on trying to understand emotions. Why do we have them? What's the purpose of them? What are the different types of emotions that we have? How do we recognize them and name them and label them, both in ourselves and in each other? And when emotions do become intense and unpleasant, difficult to manage, they can become something that we call distress, really. So we're just going to consider how we might develop greater tolerance to having distressing emotions and managing those. I hope you're not put off by this graph. I'm going to use it to try to explain the relationship between our mentalizing ability, so our capacity to keep on reflecting on our experiences and the experiences of those that we're engaged with, and our levels of emotional activation or arousal, as it were. So you can see on the graph that they're on the bottom, moving from left to right, we're looking at our levels of emotional arousal, how emotionally activated we are at any time, moving from low emotional activation right at the left-hand side of the graph. And as we move to the right, our emotional activation is gradually increasing. And then if we look on the other axis at the left-hand side of the graph, we're looking from the bottom of the graph moving to the top. We're looking at our mentalizing reflective capacity. Okay, and you'll see the dark blue line on the graph, which starts low, and then as it moves across from left to right, the levels of mentalizing capacity and ability start to rise, and then it reaches a point where it doesn't rise anymore, and actually it starts to go back the other way, and mentalizing ability starts to decrease. So that dark blue line represents our mentalizing ability within our what we call the evolved mammalian brain. So in evolution, generally speaking, the bit of our brains at the front, what we call the frontal lobes, the bit just behind our forehead, is the most recently evolved part of the brain. So we call that the evolved mammalian brain. And that is the seat of all our mentalizing, because we needed to evolve this capacity to reflect on ourselves and others as we evolved into becoming a social animal, where we needed to cooperate with each other, needing to negotiate, being in a social group. So that bit which we call the frontal lobes of the evolved mammalian brain is where all of that mentalizing happens, that reflecting on emotions, reflecting on our experiences. So as I was saying, as we move from the left-hand side of the graph, at the bottom there, where our emotional activation is not very high at all, and therefore we're not needing to have to mentalize. But gradually, as our emotional activation increases, there's more of a demand on us to need to reflect and mentalize about our experiences. And so as we start to move from left to right, things might be happening in our lives that are challenging us to mentalize. For instance, right at that left-hand corner, bottom corner, I might just have woken up. So I'm not, I'm semi-conscious. I'm just coming into the world from having been asleep. And the first task I might have is a discussion with my partner about whose turn it is to go and make the tea first thing in the morning. And that might start to challenge me a bit. I might be thinking, I'm sure it wasn't my turn, but there we go. We might have to manage the sort of feelings of that kind of discussion. I then, as I go and put the kettle on, start to make the tea, I then open the fridge and realise there's no milk in the fridge. So that's going to activate me emotionally a bit more. So my emotional activation starts to increase. I'm having to mentalize a bit more to manage that. Then I might have a really difficult journey into work. Whether that's a train journey or a difficult journey on the roads with lots of traffic, maybe people cutting me up, challenging my emotions, I may be getting more emotionally activated. Then when I get into work, I might find some very difficult emails from my boss who's questioning my performance in some way, which might be, making me more emotionally aroused. There might be other things that happen, that someone makes a joke that I feel offended by, and gradually as this all builds up, my levels of emotional activation are increasing. And for all of us, it reaches a point whereby our mentalizing ability starts to reaches a threshold point where it starts to decrease, because we all have a threshold point where we um, uh, our mentalizing capacity starts to switch off, and the more primitive parts of our brain, what we would call the primitive reptilian brain, starts to take over. So that's all of our sort of fight flight response, the more immediate sort of response where your body's preparing itself for facing some kind of threat. And as that takes over, our ability to mentalize and reflect starts to switch off. And this happens in all of us. So this is a natural process, as it were. But you'll see on the graph that there's two light blue lines. And all of us have a varying switch point. Some of us are more able to tolerate increased emotional activation than others of us. Some of us have that switch point where the fight-flight response kicks in much earlier. And we think that the differences between us are caused by both our biology, as it were, the way we're made up, our DNA. Some of us are born with more capacity to tolerate high emotional activation. Some of us are born with less capacity. But we also think that our early experiences, the way we've been cared for, also affects our capacity to tolerate strong emotions. So the mixture of those two things will affect how able we are to keep mentalizing when emotions are getting more and more intense for us. The other thing to say about this is that we can vary in that capacity as well, depending on how stressed we are generally in our life, depending on our circumstances in our life. I suspect that for all of us at the moment during this coronavirus epidemic, where there's so many uncertainties, so many worries, so many impacts on our everyday lives, that we're all feeling a bit more stressed. So we're all probably a bit less tolerant of emotional activation. So having considered that general relationship between mentalizing and our general levels of emotional activation, I'd like to invite you to start to think about the different emotions that you have, the different types of emotions that we have. So I'd just like to invite you to spend some minutes just thinking about what are the different emotions and feelings that you have and that you have had in your life. Just list them all. There's no right or wrong answers here. I just want to invite you to start to think about different kinds of emotions and how they might affect you. So here is a comprehensive list of different feelings and emotions. It's not exhaustive. There's many different types of emotions. For instance, on this list, I don't think I can see envy, which is a very common emotion, a common human experience. But we're really, in this exercise, inviting you to start to distinguish different types of emotion and maybe notice how differently they affect you. Maybe some of the emotions that didn't come to your mind is interesting, isn't it? How that may be that we've overlooked some emotions and others are more prominent for us. Because each of us will have our own individual profile, as it were, in relation to the range of emotions that we become aware of in ourselves, and also those emotions that are more problematic for some of us as against others. So we're going to make a distinction now between what we call basic emotions and what we call newer social emotions. Basic emotions are those that exist in all mammals, while newer emotions exist in more developed primates and humans and are much more um, linked to us becoming social beings that operate in social groups. So basic emotions are localized in the same area in the brain, and they evoke the same physical reactions, and each of them are linked to a set reaction pattern. So in this sense, they are innate, inbuilt reactions within us that we don't have to learn because they're almost instinctive within us, and their reaction patterns because they're determined by nature. Although we can still distance ourselves from them, which is a topic that we will return to in a little while. But these automatic responses have been important for human survival over the course of our evolution, really. So the main purpose of these emotions, as I was just saying, is to do with our survival. So you'll see here that we've identified 7 really basic emotions or reaction patterns that all have a physical basis to them initially. So if we think about fear, fear is something that has developed really as a signal to us that we might be facing some kind of danger, some kind of threat. So the physical reaction in us, which might be about our heart rate starting to increase, our breathing getting quicker and shallower. This is the fight-flight response, by the way, getting activated in us. And it's preparing us to either fight the threat or the danger that we're encountering or to run away from it. So this is built in for us. And for instance, if we're facing a tiger in the jungle, we need to quickly notice the danger and respond to it. If we think about anger, we think about that as something that's informing us that we're encountering some kind of obstacle, or something that's standing in our way. And the intensity of our anger might be influenced by how important the issue is that we feel we're being blocked in relation to. So it served a purpose of us trying to overcome obstacles. Love and caring motivates us to care for our offspring, our social group, our family. So that's a big survival mechanism for us as a social animal, as I was saying. Separation anxiety and sadness. These emotions function as an appeal, as it were, for others to take care of us. These emotions signal to potential caregivers that one is in need, maybe in danger or in need of protection, or we've become isolated from our group or family, or we've lost something and we're needing the help of our caregivers. Sexual lust has a role in encouraging reproduction and the continuation of our genes. Play and joy stimulates interaction with others, and I guess promotes us as a pack animal rather than individuals, and increases our skills of interacting with each other, limits to our own excitement, and enables the development of strategies for dealing with different situations through things like rough and tumble play. And then the last of these basic emotions is something that we don't always identify as an emotion, but it is very important, which is our interest and our curiosity, or the thing that promotes us to explore our environment and find resources and things that are useful for us in our surroundings. And again, this has been very important for our survival. So by identifying these basic emotions, we're not saying that these emotions are any more important than the social emotions that can be equally powerful and intense, and have an equally significant impact on us. But it's just that these basic emotions are sort of primed within us. And so as we develop our exploration of these matters around emotions, we'll start to think about when these things become problematic. But we're essentially wanting you to kind of grasp the notion that emotions are actually useful to us. They're a signal to us about what we might be encountering, and they're natural and they're normal. This is notwithstanding that they can become problematic for us, as I was saying earlier, when either we can become too cut off from our emotions or we can get too activated by them. So we're just going to think a little bit now about the difference between emotions and feelings. So us as humans, unlike other animals, we have the ability to suppress the feelings of our emotional reactions. And this is why the relationship between emotions and feelings can sometimes feel a bit confusing, a bit bewildering. Essentially, when we're referring to emotions, we are including our physical bodily reaction within these action programs, or these innate set reaction programs in us to specific stimuli specific things that we're facing or encountering in life. So the emotions are that physical reaction, as I was saying, in relation to fear, the increase in heart rate, the shallow, quicker breathing, we might start to sweat. It's that reaction of starting to prepare ourselves for facing a danger. The feelings are our, as it were, conscious experience, or being able to put a word to that physical experience. So somewhere in my development as a young child, as an infant, through that process, I learned to be able to notice that physical sensational experience of my heart rate increasing, my breath getting shallower, that sense of perhaps butterflies in my stomach. I learned to be able to know that is fear. So I could call it fear, and that's the feeling. I can say, I'm feeling frightened. So in that sense, as I was saying, it's really important that we recognize that we as humans can suppress the feelings of our emotional reactions. So I can be having that physical experience of fear, the emotion of it, but I can suppress the conscious recognition of that emotional experience. And so I can have the physical reaction, but perhaps not know that I'm frightened. And that can happen for a lot of those different emotions that we've identified. Essentially, that is developed, I think, as a sort of protective mechanism for us that protects us from the experience of emotions becoming too intense and overwhelming to us. So we've learned to be able to shut those things off. The problem for us going forward and functioning in our lives is that if we've become too cut off, too able to shut off our emotions, we lose the kind of signal, the benefit of the emotion that tells us actually we're encountering something that we need to take heed of. We're now going to focus on emotional discomfort, or what's often referred to as distress. We may not like it, but experiencing unpleasant emotions is a natural part of life. There's a difference, however, between disliking unpleasant emotions, but nevertheless accepting that they're an inevitable part of our experiences in life, and I suppose in that sense trying to ride through them, versus experiencing unpleasant emotions as unbearable and needing to get rid of them in some way. We're going to go on to look at the different ways that we may try to avoid experiencing distressing emotions. But being intolerant of experiencing emotional discomfort can lead to a whole range of problems, which we'll go on to identify. And usually the consequences of desperately needing to escape the uncomfortable emotion through whatever means can be quite damaging to our lives. So we can tend to be intolerant of high intensity emotional experiences when the emotion is really hot, strong or powerful, such as the despair we might feel after an argument with a loved one, or an intense fear about having to give a speech. Or there may be lower intensity emotions, such as feeling a pang of sadness when remembering a painful separation from someone we love, or nervousness about meeting someone new at a social gathering. It's not necessarily always the higher intensity emotions that can be intolerable to us, but it's much more how much you fear the emotion and how unpleasant it is to you and how much you want to get away from it that determines if you're intolerant of it. It's also not necessarily obviously negative emotions that can be difficult to deal with. Some of us can be distressed by positive emotions. Some of us can find it really disconcerting and really disturbing to start to have feelings of warmth towards someone, for instance. Or if we start to get hopeful about a situation, that can be equally disturbing. So it's not necessarily what we would describe as typically negative emotions, such as fear, anger, shame, humiliation, as much as those are and can be very unpleasant. But there are what we might deem more positive emotions can be equally disturbing for us. So I'd just like now to invite you to list the names of the different emotions and emotional states that you find most difficult to deal with, and to also reflect a bit about how you found yourself dealing with those states. Typical ways you've found yourself trying to manage those difficult emotional states. Here is a list of some of the common escape methods for avoiding distress that our service users often describe to us. It's not an exhaustive list. There may be other methods of trying to escape distressing emotions and feelings that you have for yourself that are different to these. But you can see that all of these, if they become routine and common, can have quite a damaging effect. Whilst they provide some temporary respite from distressing emotions, they have consequences that can be quite damaging for our lives. So there's often a balance between getting some respite and distraction from emotions and the damaging consequences that some of these ways of getting that respite have on us. So what we're encouraging you to do is perhaps something that's a bit counterintuitive or that goes against your second nature. That we're inviting you to, rather than try to avoid the experience of distress, to try to accept that distress is a part of everyone's life, and that's something that we need to learn to tolerate better. You probably may not realize that over time you've learned to tolerate lots of different things. For example, people you don't like, or not getting your own way, for instance, or doing things you don't like doing, bad drivers on the road, all sorts of things that we have to tolerate in life. I think the first step towards accepting distress is to start to see your feelings and emotions in a different light. I mean, as we've discussed in this module already, emotions and emotional discomforts are very normal, universal human experience. And not only this, that emotions are useful to our survival. They're a source of information about what we're encountering. Fear tells us there is a threat and prepares us for dealing with the situation. Anger can protect us from injustice or mistreatment. Sadness helps to keep us connected to our lives and other people, telling us what we care about. Another way to look at emotions differently is to recognize that they're not permanent, they're fluid, they ebb and they flow, and they pass with intensity like a wave. So we're really asking you to just shift how you think about distress. To help us with developing our reflections on distress and managing distress, we're going to return to Michelle and Lila, who we introduced to you in the first module. In this scenario, Michelle has accompanied Lila to a family gathering of hers. It's the first time he's met her family. During the gathering, Michelle finds himself frequently left on his own, whilst Lila was engrossed in conversations with different members of her family. After a time, Michelle gets his phone out and starts to send emotional text messages to Lila, saying things like, "I'm really sorry for letting you down. I must be making a bad impression. It's better that I just leave before I spoil everything for you." So I'd like to invite you to think about this scenario and wonder what emotions might Michelle be feeling in this. And alongside that, how do you think Michelle is managing his distress in this scenario? these are the themes that have tended to come out when we've discussed this scenario with groups previously. You can see there's quite a wide range of different emotions people identify that Michelle might be feeling in this scenario, ranging from generally feeling anxious, self-conscious in this social setting that's strange to him, a sense that he may be feeling quite ignored and overlooked by Lila and rejected by her and perhaps by his family if he doesn't feel that he's connecting very well with them, and perhaps jealous of Lila and the attention she's paying to her family and feeling left out in that sense, and maybe feeling angry as a result of all of this and hurt. And there's something in the way that he writes his text messages that suggests a sense that he's feeling inadequate. He's blaming himself, saying things would be much better if he wasn't there. So it's a really complex range of possible emotions that he might be feeling. And of course, in this module, we're sort of breaking things down and simplifying things much of the time in a sort of interpersonal scenario like this. We're all probably feeling a complex mixture of emotions and layers of them. We may only be conscious of the ones on the surface. So often we might be manifesting, anger, say, but not showing that underneath we might be feeling quite hurt. There's general consensus here that Michelle doesn't seem to be managing his feelings and his distress very well. And in that sense, he maybe isn't fully aware of some of his emotions or the depth of them. And he certainly isn't communicating really how he's feeling. There's no right or wrong way when it comes to practicing accepting emotional distress, but here are some guidelines that might help with the process. But essentially, we have to find what works for us, really. As I was saying earlier, there's a trade-off often between finding ways of distracting ourselves and getting some respite from distressing emotional experiences and the consequences of whatever those distracting methods are for us. But one of the things that we think is helpful in being able to accept our distress is to develop this capacity to just watch and observe. Try to take a stance of observing your emotions, and I guess this is back to that concept of mentalizing, really. Paying attention as if we were a third person, really, looking in on ourselves to whatever we're feeling in the present moment, and watch how that might change with intensity from moment to moment, or maybe change into a different emotion as time progresses. Secondly, it can often help if we're able to name or label or describe the emotional experience that we're having. And checking in with how the emotions might be manifesting in our physical experience. Noticing I can feel those butterflies in my stomach, then I think I'm feeling frightened and anxious. Or I can notice this sort of, I've been grinding my teeth and I can feel tightness in my jaw. I'll wonder if I'm feeling quite frustrated and angry. Or I can feel this lump or tightness in my throat. Am I feeling quite sad at the moment? So, because it's when we can label those emotions, and then the next step would be to perhaps put that in a context. So, what is it that might be making me feel frightened at the moment? It's when we can put things in a context that the intensity of emotions perhaps lessens. Be curious and non-judgmental. Try to ask yourself if you can understand what's led to you feeling this way. It's neither good or bad or right or wrong. It is what it is. You are feeling what you're feeling right now. We can't change it, can't change the bad and aversive things that have happened to us. We can try to see if we can understand why we're feeling what we are. Some of us will have grown up or internalized certain messages about feelings that may not help us with this task of understanding what we're feeling or being curious or judgmental about it. If we've grown up with a culture whereby we're told that we've got to keep a stiff upper lip, or it's a sign of weakness to show any emotion, then we're probably not going to manage or accept our distress very well. Some people find imagery helpful, perhaps thinking of emotions like clouds in the sky or leaves in a stream, watching them as they move by in their own time. Or others can think of emotions as an express train or an ocean wave. Or maybe there's a different image, all of your own, that can help you pay attention to your emotions in a helpful way and ultimately tolerate them rather than trying to rid yourself of them. Or other people find it helpful to describe to oneself a favourite place, using all your senses, or imagine a positive figure or a coach or protector, positive figure by your side, helping you when you're feeling weak or hopeless. And I think it's also helpful to try and bring yourself into the present moment, because sometimes our emotions can trigger sort of thought patterns that we either start to imagine the worst scenario developing, or we get caught in memories of bad things happening to us. So trying to bring ourselves into the present moment can be helpful. And often ways of doing that is to sort of kind of engage with your senses, to maybe touch something, a piece of furniture, to bring yourself into the here and now, to look around you, notice what's there, listen to the sounds, those sorts of things, and even taste or drinking, the sensation of drinking a glass of water. So those things that could help to bring you into the present moment and take you away from those thoughts that run away. And then lastly, it's common and normal for, maybe an emotion we've ridden through it and it's started to decrease and recede. It's quite normal for that emotion to come back again. And it doesn't mean that you've failed when this happens. It just brings you back to the beginning of where you started. Sometimes people mistakenly, I think, believe the goal is to be so completely absorbed in the present moment that they don't feel any emotions at all. But as I was saying, we're trying not to rid ourselves of emotions here. We're trying to find ways of being with them in a more, perhaps more constructive way.